April 23rd, 1965, the Apollo Theater in Harlem. Backstage smelled like sweat, hair pomade, and nervous energy. The floorboards still vibrated from James Brown's 90-minute performance. The Motown Revue had finished their set an hour earlier, polished and professional as always. And now the dressing rooms were packed with musicians, dancers, and hangers-on, all still buzzing from what they'd witnessed. Some replayed James's moves in their heads. Others wondered if they'd ever command a stage like that. James Brown hadn't just performed. He'd claimed territory. Every scream, every spin, every impossible note had been a declaration that this was his house, his music, his world. And everyone backstage knew it. The younger singers clustered around him like disciples, asking questions about breathing techniques and stage moves. And James held court with the easy confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. Marvin Gaye sat in the corner, still wearing his performance suit, a cigarette burning between his fingers. He'd been watching James all night, not with envy exactly, but with something quieter. Curiosity maybe, or recognition. At 25, Marvin was already successful by most standards. He'd had hits at Motown, his voice was all over the radio, and women threw themselves at him after every show. But he also knew what people said about him behind his back. Pretty boy, smooth, safe, the kind of singer mothers approved of and fathers didn't worry about. James Brown was everything Marvin wasn't supposed to be: raw, dangerous, unpredictable. The kind of performer who made audiences lose their minds, who turned concerts into religious experiences, who sweated through 3 shirts in a single show and left the stage looking like he'd been in a fistfight with God. "Y'all Motown boys sing nice," James was saying to the group around him, his voice still hoarse from the performance. "Real nice. Clean harmonies, pretty melodies, all that. But can you make people sweat? Can you make them scream?" He paused, taking a long drink of water. "Or are you just going to keep crooning for the ladies while the real soul men do the heavy lifting?" The room got quieter. Not silent, but quieter. Enough that Marvin could hear the specific quality of the pause. Conversations dying mid-sentence, when someone said something that might lead somewhere uncomfortable. One of the younger Motown singers laughed nervously, trying to diffuse the moment. But James wasn't laughing. He was looking directly at Marvin now, and there was something in his eyes that wasn't quite hostile, but wasn't friendly either. It was the look of a champion who just spotted potential competition and needed to establish the hierarchy before things got complicated. "Marvin," James said, and his voice was almost gentle. "Almost. Baby, you got a pretty voice. Beautiful even. I heard how sweet it is on the radio yesterday, and I thought, that boy can sing. But you know what else I thought?" Marvin didn't answer. He just took another drag from his cigarette and waited. "I thought, he ain't got no grit. You can't get down and dirty like a real soul man. You sing like you're afraid to mess up your suit." The room was completely silent now. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted their weight from one foot to the other. The kind of silence that makes everyone hyper-aware of their breathing. Marvin stubbed out his cigarette slowly, giving himself time to think. He could feel everyone watching, waiting to see how he'd respond to being called out by the Godfather of Soul. He could laugh it off, make a joke, agree and move on. That's probably what most people expected. But something in Marvin's chest was tightening. Not anger exactly, something older than that. Something that had been there since he was a kid singing in his father's church, since the first time someone told him his voice was too soft, too pretty, not strong enough for real gospel. Something that had been quietly accumulating every time a music critic called him smooth or polished, when they really meant not dangerous enough. Marvin stood up. The movement was so casual that it took people a second to realize he was walking toward the door, not away from James, toward the stage. "Marvin," one of the Motown guys called after him. "Where you going, man? Show's over." Marvin didn't turn around. He just kept walking, down the narrow hallway, past the dressing rooms, past the stage manager who looked up confused, past the curtains and out onto the empty Apollo stage. The house lights were on, harsh and unflattering, revealing every scuff mark on the floor. The audience was gone. The band had packed up. It was just Marvin and 1,500 empty seats, and the ghost of James Brown's performance still hanging in the air. Behind him, he heard footsteps. The entire backstage crowd was following him out, James Brown at the front, looking more curious than concerned. "What you doing, Marvin?" James asked. Marvin walked to the microphone stand at center stage, adjusted it to his height. Then he turned toward the wings where the house band's drummer was still breaking down his kit. "Hey," Marvin called out, "you got 5 more minutes in you?" The drummer looked at the stage manager, who shrugged. "I mean, yeah, I guess." "Good. Give me a groove. Something nasty." The drummer sat back down, confused but game. He started laying down a simple 4/4 beat, nothing fancy, just a solid foundation. The bass player, who'd been coiling cables, heard the drums and picked up his instrument almost on instinct. Then the piano player. Then the horn section, who'd been halfway out the door. Within 30 seconds, the Apollo House Band was cooking again, laying down a groove that was raw and dirty, and absolutely nothing like the polished Motown sound they'd been playing an hour earlier. Marvin closed his eyes, listened, found the pocket in the rhythm, that space between the snare and the hi-hat where a voice could live, and then he started to sing, but not the way anyone expected. The first verse came out smooth, controlled, exactly the pretty boy singing James had been talking about. Clean phrasing, perfect pitch, the kind of vocal that would make any A&R man nod in approval. Marvin doing what everyone thought he did best. And then, on the second verse, something shifted. His voice got rougher. Not worse. Rougher. Like he was dragging it across concrete, letting the smooth edges scrape away until what was left was raw nerve and truth. He started using his chest voice in ways Motown producers always told him not to, grunting and growling and letting notes crack in places they were supposed to stay perfect. He took James Brown's signature scream, that impossible high-pitched wail that defied physics, and he didn't copy it. He answered it. Marvin's version was different, more controlled maybe, but just as primal, just as liable to raise the hair on the back of your neck. By the bridge, Marvin had abandoned conventional singing entirely. He was using his voice as percussion, chopping out rhythms with his throat, humming bass lines, creating harmonies with himself through nothing but breath control and timing. The band was watching him now, adjusting their playing to match what he was doing, following his lead even though they'd never played with him before. And then came the part that no one who was there would ever forget. Marvin stopped singing, completely. Just stood there at the microphone, listening to the band, and then he started moving. Not dancing exactly, but not standing still either. He started incorporating James Brown's footwork, those impossible slides and spins, but filtered through his own body, his own rhythm. Where James was explosive, Marvin was fluid. Where James was angular, Marvin was circular. And while he was moving, he started singing again. But now he was doing something that shouldn't have been possible. He was transitioning from a deep, growling bass note to a falsetto so high and pure it could shatter glass. And he was doing it in less than 3 seconds, in the space between two drum beats, without any break, without any strain, like his vocal cords were made of something more flexible than human tissue. The horn section tried to follow him, but he was moving too fast, jumping between registers with a fluidity that seemed to bypass normal human anatomy entirely. The band was fully locked in now, stretching the groove, making space for Marvin to explore. The bass player was grinning, shaking his head in disbelief while his fingers kept walking the line. 6 minutes in, and nobody wanted it to stop. Not the musicians, not the stage crew, not James Brown, who was standing in the wings with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Marvin brought it home with a final run that quoted James's own phrasing from "I got you, I feel good," but inverted it, made it his own, turned it into something that honored the original, while simultaneously transcending it. And then he held the final note, just held it, sustaining a high B-flat for what felt like forever, not showing off exactly, but making a point about control, about power, about what was possible when you stopped trying to choose between pretty and powerful and just decided to be everything. When he finally let the note go, the silence in the Apollo was total. Marvin opened his eyes, looked out at the empty seats, turned toward the wings where James Brown was standing. James walked onto the stage slowly. He wasn't smiling, but he wasn't angry either. He just looked at Marvin for a long moment, processing what he'd just witnessed, recalculating assumptions he'd held for years about what separated the real soul men from the smooth operators. And then he did something that shocked everyone watching. He walked up to Marvin and extended his hand. "Boy," James said quietly, and his voice had lost all its performance edge, all its showmanship. It was just honest now, just real. "I was wrong. You don't just sing. You got the Holy Ghost and the devil in the same voice, and that's something nobody can teach. That's something you're born with, and you either use it or you bury it. You just used it." Marvin shook his hand, didn't say anything, didn't need to. James turned to the crowd of musicians watching from the wings. "Y'all just witnessed something. This man right here, he just showed us you don't have to choose. You can be smooth and powerful, pretty and dangerous, Motown and soul." He looked back at Marvin. "I respect that. I respect you." The two men stood there on the empty Apollo stage for another moment, and something passed between them that didn't require words. An understanding, a recognition of two different approaches to the same fundamental truth about music, about performance, about what it meant to give yourself completely to a song. Years later, in a 1968 interview with Ebony magazine, James Brown would be asked about that night at the Apollo. "Marvin Gaye," he said, "showed me something I needed to see. You can be a gentleman and still have soul. You can wear a nice suit and still tear up a stage. I had my way and he had his way, and both ways were right. That's what I learned from him." The two men never became close friends. Their lives were too different, their paths too separate, but they maintained a mutual respect that lasted until Marvin's death in 1984. And when James Brown heard the news that Marvin had been shot by his father, he called the funeral home privately and paid for part of the arrangements. Not publicly, not for credit. Just because that's what you did for someone who'd earned your respect on an empty stage in Harlem 20 years earlier. The Apollo performance was never recorded. No bootleg surfaced. No grainy footage appeared decades later. It existed only in the memories of the 40 or 50 people backstage that night. But those people told the story, and it spread, and it became mythology. The night Marvin Gaye proved that pretty boys could have teeth. The night James Brown acknowledged that soul came in more than one flavor. The night two different approaches to black music met on common ground. Backstage afterward, Marvin didn't celebrate or gloat. He just went back to his dressing room, lit another cigarette, and sat quietly while the adrenaline drained from his system. One of the younger Motown singers stuck his head in. "Man, that was incredible. How'd you do that?" Marvin took a drag, considered the question. "I stopped trying to be what people expected," he said finally, "and I just sang." It was the simplest answer, and the truest one.